Once upon a time, there was a man. He was a drunk, a womanizer. He was an excellent sportsman. He also was the owner and publisher of a newspaper, and he had a good eye for a story. One day, he summoned Henry Morton Stanley into his office, and he said, "I think Dr. David Livingstone is in need of help. Go and find him." And then he says, "There's $1,000. Go find him. And when that runs out, there's another $1,000. But find Dr. Livingstone. Even if he's dead, find him." Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much for coming out here tonight in the frost and the ice. And I'd especially like to thank Holly and Gillian and all the staff of the Borough Hall for organising tonight's test performance. And I'd like to thank you all individually for coming here, and my family, and especially my two granddaughters, Fia and Millie. The reason I'm having a test performance is because I've never spoken public before. And the reason I'm going to speak in public is because I've been invited to give a talk in Brooklands early next year, and I've been invited to talk later in Ireland and in Switzerland. And the reason I've been invited to talk is because of a book I had published last year. It's about the early life of James Gordon Bennett, and it's also about the early life of motor car racing. Tonight's talk is only going to be about James Gordon Bennett. Some of it's in this book, some of it's in a second book that's coming out, but there'll be time at the end to ask questions about the motor car racing if you want. The complication is there were two Gordon Bennetts, and they both changed the face of the newspaper industry and journalism forever. Why is there a monument in Herald Square, New York, to James Gordon Bennett? In fact, why is Herald Square called Herald Square? And why are there islands in Russia called Bennett Islands? And they even named an asteroid after him. And in fact, if you go to the French Tennis Open, I can't pronounce the stadium, but it's a big tennis stadium in Paris. And if you walk out of it, one of the exits, you'll walk into the Avenue de Gordon Bennett. And the reason is because they changed the face of journalism. But I'm going to talk about the two Gordon Bennetts. I'm going to briefly mention James Gordon Bennett Sr., and then I'll talk about his son. And the first one is a Scotsman. And why isn't there a monument to James Gordon Bennett in Scotland? Because of what he done. He was brought up in Newmill in Banff, and he was born into a Catholic family, but he had a good Protestant education because he left it with a great knowledge of Greek, Latin, bookkeeping, and the King James Bible. So he had a good dose of religion when he was a child and a teenager. When he was at Aberdeen Grammar, he joined the Romantic movement because he loved books, and he was greatly inspired by the writer Sir Walter Scott, and he was also greatly inspired by the Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith, and his other hero was Benjamin Franklin. But by the time Bennett had turned the age 25, he turned his back on religion and emigrated to North America. And for 5 years he worked in journalism, learning the ins and outs of journalism, and he was also a translator, and he worked his way up to be sub-editor of a newspaper. But he was still an idealist, and he thought that the papers didn't do justice to the common man. At that time, there was thousands of people coming from Europe to America. There was a shortage in newspapers. In fact, some of the more generous gentry would give their newspaper to the servant, and they would tear off strips of them and read it among themselves or read it to their friends or family in the streets. But he also thought that the content of newspapers let people down. They were just like text, and they were very boring. They had long, tedious editorials. Let us look at this another way. Imagine if you went to get a newspaper and you couldn't get it only if you bought it by subscription. And then if you bought it, there was no headlines on it, no photos, no drawings, no graphs, no news from battlefields, no interviews with famous or notorious people, and no school reports, no sports column, no women's column, no fashion page, and no ads. It'd be pretty dull. So Bennett thought the paper let down people badly because they were hungry for knowledge. So in 1835, on 2 barrels, Bennett laid out 2 planks of wood in a small dingy office in New York, and he was the only employee of it. He started the penny press, or more accurately, the 1-cent press. And he scoured the streets in New York by day, and he found out about Wall Street, and he found out about the police and all that. Because he promised these people in the first edition that I will just give you common sense. I will give you poetry, health issues, the theatre, and the corruption of Wall Street. But he was also a very canny Scotsman. He came up with the idea of putting ads in the paper. That way you're getting revenue before you ever sell a piece of paper. People came to his office and put in small ads, and he was unscrupulous. He didn't care what the ads were for, and people loved it, so he was earning money straight away. His bookkeeping didn't go to any waste with him. And then he got young boys as hawkers to sell them on the streets in New York. And lo and behold, in a few years, the New York Herald had grown tremendously. There was offices all over the States. He also started a new thing. He sent journalists to the battlefields, and there was a lot of battles going on with Native Americans and that. And he could actually get the news to the American president quicker than the army could, because he started off with a Pony Express, like fast riders. And then when the telegraphs came, he used telegraphs. And 5 years down the line, he was at a wedding of one of his staff. And he met this young Irish woman, Henrietta Agnes Crean. She was a teacher. Her mother was a Lynch, which maybe gave me a special interest in the subject. And in a few months, the two of them were married. But Henrietta was in for a fierce disappointment. You know, you would think that she would have all the trappings that the wife of a New York millionaire would. They didn't have a box office at the theatre. They didn't have a box office at the opera. They didn't get invited to any grand openings. They didn't get invited to any diplomatic dinners. In fact, they got invited to no dinners at all. And in fact, her life turned worse because her husband had a real good Scottish work ethic. The more he was criticised, the stubborner he was, the longer hours he worked at his paper, and which left Henrietta very lonely. And the papers got to Henrietta, they slandered her and criticised her. His rival newspapers, I'm talking about. And then one evening, they went out for a stroll in Central Park, and a gang of thugs jumped on Bennett and they beat him up. But the worst of it was the police stood idly by. Bennett was always exposing the police, if he could. So the police stood idly by and let him get beaten up. And she thought, I'm having enough of this. So she took the two children and moved to Paris. They never lived together as man and wife then, and young Bennett was only 9 years old at the time, and his sister Jeanette was 5 or 6. And they never lived as man and wife, but she brought the two children over every summer to New York to spend time with their father. And now I'm getting on to the second part of the talk, which is about younger Bennett, the man we're more interested in. Young Bennett was different than his father because the New Yorkers hated Gordon Bennett Sr. They despised him. They never accepted him. But his peers as a teenager, they loved him. He was a bit of a novelty because he came over, he spoke with a French accent. In fact, he could speak 3 languages. And he was a prankster, and he was a good sportsman. He was good with a gun, a good shot. He was an excellent sailor, and he could handle horses very well. He actually loved horses. And he was also good with his fists. So he got off to a great start with his New York peers. And he was such a good sailor that he started winning races up and down the Hudson River and out New York Bay. And he became the youngest member of New York Yacht Club. And in a few years, he was promoted to Vice Commodore and then Commodore, a title which he held all his life. And he held it proudly because he expected his staff and all his underlings to address him as Commodore. But the other thing he was good at was handling horses. And at the time, there was a pastime called a coach and 4 horses, where you sat on top of a carriage and you raced 4 horses on top of the carriage. And observers said he was like a man possessed by a demon when he sat aloft in this. And he galloped the horses, lashing the reins till they almost dropped. And he was also a drunk from he was a teenager as well. His peers would dare him into doing all kinds of things. Like he rode up a posh casino on a horse one evening, and he rode on top of his horse and carriage naked, terrorizing the pedestrians in New York and Paris. So he was up for any kind of devilment. But he also liked to impress girls, and he would do this by taking them out in New York State in the carriage to show them scenery. They would get in the carriage and he'd ride it. And one day, he took a young girl called Jenny out in the carriage to impress her. But when he got up on top of the carriage, his love of speed took control of him, and he galloped the horse like mad, took a corner too fast or went over a bump, can't remember. But the carriage overturned and he almost killed young Jenny. And because the carriage got wrecked, Bennett was okay, he jumped clear. And what a difference history would be had Jenny got killed. She recovered, thankfully, because she went on to become the mother of Winston Churchill. Well, she became Lady Randolph Churchill first. And surprisingly, Jenny and Bennett remained friends all their life. And in fact, the Churchills as a family regularly went on holidays. He had a villa in Saint-Germain, he had a house in the French Riviera, and he had an estate in Rutherfordshire in England. And the Churchills often went there, and in fact had the resources to go to the Churchills' family albums. I'm sure there'll be lots of pictures of Bennett there. So we're getting on now till Bennett was in his 20s. He'd started to learn a bit about the newspaper industry from his father, and he wanted to do service for his country. He wanted to fight in the civil war that was going on at the time, and he wanted to fight in the Union side. And his father and the American president were on first name terms, so Bennett asked his father about getting a cadetship for Bennett in the Navy, as he was such an accomplished seaman. And the president gave him pulled a few strings and got him a job in the Navy. And he only worked on patrol off I think it was the east coast of America. And one night while he was on the bridge, he fell asleep, as you do on watch, and the ship almost ran aground on Florida. But just before it ran aground, he got awakened by the hoot of an owl. And Bennett was very superstitious and he had a fierce love of animals. He surrounded himself by owls for the rest of his life. He had stuffed owls, owls in cages, owls all over his office. It's very hard to get a big owl at short notice. That's the only one I could get. And even when he took over his father's newspaper, he changed the logo on the stationery, the office stationery, and had owls on it. And the other thing he loved was Pekingese dogs. In any photo you see of him, there's always Pekingese dogs yelping at his heels. And all his servants were under strict orders to feed the dogs the best of meat and only bottled water, and keep the dogs. He even had dogs in his yacht, on his yachts. So after the war ended, Bennett went back to New York and he was working in the Herald office for his father. And he still liked to party, still liked to get drunk at night. And he was a member of the Union Club, which was for all the wealthy men of New York. It was a men-only club. And a couple of him and his mates one night got into a bragging competition about who was the best sailor and who had the best yacht. So in the wind-up in 1866, they decided to sail across the Atlantic and see who won the race. There was 3 yachts took part. As it happened, Bennett won the race, and the yacht ended in Cowes Bay and the Isle of Wight. And lo and behold, Queen Victoria was in residence there for for the Christmas season, and she invited Bennett to dinner after the yacht race. It was the first of many meetings that Bennett would have with, a few meetings he would have with Queen Victoria, because he loved royalty, and he used to go to Ascot every year, and he had his house there. And when his yacht and the Queen's royal yacht were in the same port, they visited one another. And the British team challenged him while he was there for another yacht race. And the following year, they had another race, but this time it was from Cork, going across the Atlantic the other way to New York. But Bennett lost, and he wasn't a very good loser. He never took part in any yacht races then, but he still loved yachts. And by this time, his father was getting near retiring age, and I think it was President Lincoln, but yeah, the American president offered him the most coveted diplomatic job in the diplomatic corps, the ambassador to Paris, which was supposed to be a great job, thinking he would want to be reunited with Henrietta again for his latter years. But Bennett had become so reclusive then that he turned it down, and he never took him up in his offer of a post. And shortly after that, he signed over the New York Herald in its entirety to his son. He died about a year after that, his father, and Henrietta died 6 months later. She'd remained in Paris all her life. Her dying wish, though, was to be reunited with her husband, so she was her remains brought across the Atlantic, and he was buried with her. And young Bennett was 27 when he got handed the biggest newspaper in America at that time, but he had ambitions too, and he wanted to make the Herald the biggest newspaper in the world, which he did. He changed the technology, and it was him that introduced sports into it, and he put the meteorology section in it, and he also hired Mark Twain, the writer of Huckleberry Finn, to write serial stories that would give his readers more things to read. And he was always looking for good stories. As I said at the beginning, he had Henry Morton Stanley, and Stanley was his #1 war correspondent. And at that meeting, when he told Stanley to go and find Dr. Livingstone, he says, I think the man is in need of help. Go and find him. And when Stanley was leaving the office, he said to him, while you're at it, have a look at the Suez Canal, see how the steamers are doing getting through it. And it might be worthwhile to go to the Caucasus. There's a war going on there. And go down the Nile, see is there anything excavated that the tourists might like to see. And he says, check out the Euphrates Railway in Baghdad. And by then you should have heard something of Dr. Livingstone. And Stanley went off. It took him months, nearly a year, I can't remember. But en route he heard that his best bet was to go to Zanzibar, the island just off Africa, where the Arabic slave traders used to go into the interior of Africa from. And he done all the right things, because Stanley was an excellent explorer as well. He hired about 100 soldiers and porters and supplies enough for a year, and to set into the heart of Africa following the slave the route that the slaves used to come out on. And a month later or a year later, he found Dr. Livingstone in a hut, and he was in need of help. He'd had the fever, he was broke, and he was dependent entirely on the people that he was writing about and campaigning against to benefit the generosity of the scraps from the Arab slave traders. And the doctor read the letter that Bennett had given him. He could either go back with Stanley to London, or he would give him money if he wanted money. And Livingstone chose the option of money because he wanted to continue his exploring. I think he was trying to find the source of the Nile. So he asked Stanley, go back to Zanzibar, get me food and horses and all the things you need to explore with, boats. And in exchange, Livingstone had given Stanley his journals to take back to the Royal Geographic Society in London, and letters, of course, to his wife and children. Stanley got back to London, and Stanley was a hero because Livingstone was a world-renowned celebrity at that time. The Herald Scored had sold thousands of more newspapers with the story of Livingstone, and Stanley also got famous. He gave talks in Europe and he gave talks in America, and he also wrote this beautiful book, How I Found Dr. Livingstone in Central Africa, and it was a bestseller. But his boss, who was very whimsical, Bennett, was raging. He says, Stanley didn't find Livingstone, it was my money, it was the New York Herald that found him. And he sacked his journalist, and he even went on to slander him and write stories that he was a wife beater and everything. So Bennett could be nasty when he wanted to be. But Stanley had a good life afterwards, still had. He went on exploring for the King of Belgium, but that's another story. But Bennett was in his 30s then, and he only had a habit of dating actresses or singers. That was his preference. And he kind of shocked New York society when he started dating Caroline May, who was from New York high society. She was a very eligible fiancée, and the couple were engaged to be married. The trousseau had been sent over from Paris, and New York society were kind of in shock that somebody had finally tamed this wild man. And in honour of the engagement, Caroline's father and mother wanted to have a party for Bennett on New Year's Day 1877, where Gordon Bennett could meet the extended May family and all the friends and that. But the Christmas just before the New Year's, Bennett had went on a bender for a few days, and he was just drinking a lot. And on New Year's afternoon, his servant woke him up frantically on the couch and said, Master, you have to be at the Mays. There's a party for your engagement. So Bennett got up and got in the sleigh, and the driver brought him to the house. But he stopped off in a couple of pubs on the way for a cure, and he staggered into the party. And he eyed up all the people around him. And the first thing that Caroline's mother said was, No, yeah, Caroline was sitting beside her mother, and the first thing Caroline's mother was said, "It looks like Gordon slept in his suit last night." But Caroline had 4 brothers, and she just put up her hand and says, "Oh, Mama, boys will be boys, it's all right." But Bennett was still a bit glazy-eyed looking, and he knocked back 2 flutes of champagne off the servants. And then he eyed up the fireplace, and he walked over to the fireplace and leaned his hand on the mantelpiece, and he began to unbutton his fly. And by then a few men had started to form a circle around him, but Gordon continued to relieve himself into the fire. And but Caroline's mother got up and shouted, "Oh, Gordon Bennett," and she fainted, and that's how the expression, the euphemism, "Oh, Gordon Bennett," comes about. And it was famous for many years for, being startled at something, and it tended to die out then for decades until a few years ago, a payday loans company used the expression in one of their ads, and I've heard 1 or 2 people say it since then. But the men grabbed Bennett, chucked him out into the snow, and he went back home to his house. And in the morning he woke up, and his sister Jeanette had came over from Paris for the wedding, and she says, "Gordon, all you've got to do is apologise." And he wouldn't. He was fierce stubborn, and he was fierce sulky, and he didn't apologise. And Caroline broke the wedding off. There was a telegram sent or something. But Bennett went back out to his union club where he wanted to drink with the boys again. But he got a very frosty reception when he went there, because there's usually a lot of backslapping going on among the lads in the club. And instead, Caroline's brother, who was also a well-to-do New York person, he came in and started to beat up Bennett. And the only way Bennett could stop him beating him up was, he says, he challenged him to a duel, and the fight was stopping, and the duel was set for a few days. And they went to have their duel. It was at a place just outside the precincts in New York, Slaughter's Gap. The men walked their 12 paces, and they turned and fired. They were both good shots, by the way, but they chose to shoot over one another's heads, or else they missed. But that was their honour restored. They just went to the local hotel and got drunk. And Bennett thought life would be normal then, and he went to the posh restaurants that he used to frequent, and they wouldn't let him in. And the Union Club even shut their doors on him. And the other papers ran articles on him that he wasn't even house trained. Now, unlike his father, who could cope and had coped with a lifetime of rejection in New York, young Bennett was a social animal. He lived for being with his friends, drunken and getting up to all kinds of dares. He was an excellent editor of a newspaper as well, but his social life was everything for him. And he was depressed, or melancholy, as they used to call it then. He couldn't cope. So he says, "No, sod you." He turned his back on New York and left it for the home of his youth, which was Paris. He never returned to the States socially again in his life. He went there on several occasions, but he went incognito, or if he didn't go incognito, he just went to the New York Herald office, where he loved to walk into his staff in Herald Square and fire people at random. He got a buzz out of firing his staff. And but he never, even though he upheld American foreign policy and all that in his newspapers, he never socialized in America. So he ran the New York Herald from Paris for the rest of his life. And by then he also had a London edition of the New York Herald, and he had the Paris and the New York edition. And how he ran the New York Herald from Paris was via telegraph cable. You know, he would have his staff send message across in whatever code telegraph uses, because he wanted the final say in editing his paper. And the cost was astronomical. It was about $20,000 a day to send telegraphs. So he started his own telegraph cable. Well, he started it in partnership with a wealthy Irish-American, John McCoy. They started a commercial cable company. And that's how Bennett managed to run his paper. And I'll skip a good few years of his life now. The paper ran really successfully, and it went all corners of the world, including Russia and all the American embassies and that. But in 1912, Bennett decided he would make a journey back to the USA. And he decided that he'd go on the new ship that was being built, the Titanic. He wanted to check the Titanic out for himself to see was it as luxurious as the White Star Line made out. So he booked himself a luxury parlour on the Titanic, and it was to be his last trip to the USA. But a day or two before he was due to sail, he got very restless and irritated. He didn't think his staff could do good enough a job when the Titanic berthed in New York, interviewing the passengers that came off for stories of the voyage. And he had plans. At that time, newspaper companies used to send tugs out to meet the incoming liners coming across the Atlantic to get the news from Europe, you know, and interview some of the VIPs on it for their papers. And Bennett had a plan to get a tug and sail it further out into the Atlantic so he'd be first. The bottom line was he didn't trust his staff to do the job properly, so he sailed a day early in a French liner to the Herald office. And while he was in the Herald office, he went into his office. His office was called the Sanctum in the New York Herald. It was like a big conference room. And he sat down at his desk, and he was giving his journalists a briefing. And like say, you go there, you go to the gangway, you go to such and such. And while they were giving the briefing, one of his staff came in and says, there's a telegram from Newfoundland. And he started to read out the telegram. Distress signals from Titanic. Titanic sinking. Lifeboats launched. Carpathia on the way. And Bennett stood up. And you can imagine the silence in his office. And he just cleared his desk. And he said, Carpathia. And then he said to one of his staff, go and get me the passenger list from the Carpathia. And one of his staff came back in with the passenger list, and he started to read it. And there were 740 people on the Carpathia. I don't think he was reading the steerage passengers or the crew, but he scrolled down through the passenger list until he came to Miss May Birkhead, and he said, I know her. I know her. We wrote an article on her. She was a seamstress. I think she was from Louisiana. Anyway, she was a seamstress. And she wanted to make money. And we wrote an article for her. And she made shirt waists or shirt collars. And she sold them to raise money for her trip to Europe. And Bennett thought, this is a very enterprising young woman. And he said to his staff, wireless to Carpathia, hire her. And so they did, and he gave her instructions to interview the survivors as they came in off the life rafts. And she was to wireless back the information to the New York Herald, and the Herald thereby beat its rivals with the stories and interviews from the survivors of the Titanic. And again, the New York Herald, it has its first. He had a really good eye for a story. As it happened, she had a very distinguished career after in journalism. She'd done her holidays in Europe, and he hired her, and she was the editor of the fashion and society page in the Paris Herald. And she really rose to fame during the First World War because she could get the news out about the Americans very quickly. And while this was going on in the Herald office as well about the telegraph messages going back and forward, other shipping companies started to radio in that there was a hazard in the shipping lanes into New York Harbour. All the perished from the Titanic were on the surface. There was hundreds of floating remains, dead bodies from the poor people off the Titanic. And the White Star Line in London had heard about this, and they had to do something about it. And they had sent a telegram to Halifax, to a shipping agent, because Halifax was the nearest large city to the Titanic disaster, to charter 3 ships to go out and pick up the dead remains off the sea. And it so happened that the first boat that the White Star Line chartered was a ship belonging to Bennett called the Mackay Bennett. It was belonging to the commercial cable company of his, and it was only after coming into Halifax Harbour. So they got 100 tons of ice and 125 coffins, 12 tons of steel, 12 tons of iron. I'll explain about the iron in a minute, and canvas sacking and everything to sail out to the disaster site off the Grand Banks. The Bennett ship sailed out there. And in total, they also took a chaplain with them, and Herald reporters and everything, as you can imagine. But in total, they took up 305 of the perished off the sea before they sailed back to Halifax. 115 were returned to the sea, and the criteria for burying them at sea was if they were mutilated, unrecognisable, or if they were third-class passengers. The logic behind that was that the third-class families of the third-class passengers wouldn't be able to go to Halifax anyway to pick up the remains. So they were put in a sack with iron, and they had a proper Christian burial, and the remains returned to the sea. So about 190 came back to be buried in Halifax. But one of the bodies that was supposed to be put back to sea was a child, a 2-year-old boy. And the crew had picked it up very early, and they could see that the mother, in a frantic attempt to keep the boy alive, had put on 4 or 5 layers of clothes on him. And as the White Star Line's guidelines, they were going to put it back to sea. But the crew protested and says, no, we'll pay for the coffin, and we'll pay for the heirs over wages. We'll get it buried. And it so happened that was one of the biggest funerals ever in Halifax. I'm talking about Halifax, Nova Scotia, but it was one of the biggest funerals ever in Halifax. And to this day, 110 years later, apparently there's always fresh flowers on the unidentified child's grave. And it's one of the biggest tourist attractions in Halifax. In fact, all the graveyards in Halifax from the Titanic, they're kind of like going to the graveyards in France from the war. There's a Catholic one, a Jewish one, and a non-denominational one, and there's a lot of tombstones on them, or stones. And yeah, Bennett's life was, the Herald thrived for years and years, and Bennett still hadn't got married. And he loved the royalties, I say, but there was one royalty that he didn't like, and that was the Kaiser. He always warned Americans about the German Kaiser, that he had expansionist plans. And the Kaiser never understood it. He even asked American diplomats, why does Bennett like me? Because all these people with luxury yachts, they all met at the same regattas, they went to the same horse races and big events. But Bennett always hated him. He hated him so much that he wouldn't leave Paris when the Germans invaded Paris during the First World War. He says, no, America has the right of a free press. He let his staff go and fight in the war or go to England for safety. And he was like his father. In his 70s, he had to scour the streets of Paris to get stories and print the paper himself in the evenings, because he was very short of staff. He did find love, though. He met Maud Potter. She was the wife of, she was the widow of the Baron Reuters, another newspaper agency which you'll still hear the name of today. And Bennett finally found love in his 70s. His people that wrote about him said he was like a teenager all his life until he met Maud, and he found love at last in his 70s. He also fed the stray dogs in Paris, because he had a great love of dogs, and he owned several dog homes in Paris. Probably weren't operating in the World War. And he died during the World War. He died in 1918. And he left his entire estate to a charity for New York journalists, which was a home for them or a home and money for them if any of them ever fell in hard times. He didn't leave anything to his wife. Although he did allow her to stay in one of his apartments in Paris until she died. I think he left an heir. I have uncovered very compelling evidence that he has an heir. But I don't have the resources to follow it up, you know. But you can read all about it in my second book. I think he left an heir. And thank you very much for listening and coming out tonight. Excuse me.